Professor Dylan Pillai at the University of Calgary School of Medicine. I think the research and health policy response has been positive. Very early on, there was a call for proposals for rapid research funding, which my group was very fortunate to be successful in. And this has enabled us to respond very quickly to urgent needs in our area, which is diagnostic testing for COVID-19. And also in terms of health policy, this has been challenging, obviously, and for policymakers because it's an evolving process. And so one has to be nimble and ready to adapt quickly. And I think, generally speaking, across the country, there has been a positive response. To this point, I feel like we've done a good job of mitigating worst case scenarios. And yes, if you look south of the border, if you look at countries like Italy and Spain, perhaps even France, you see huge numbers of people infected, and also, importantly, the mortality rate is quite high. And so I think if you map out our current epidemic curves and fatality rates, hospitalization rates, ICU rates, it's currently in a holding pattern, and I think it's fairly steady. Having said that, there are parts of the country that are sustaining more cases than other parts. We've seen in Quebec, for example, higher rates of infection there than other parts of the country. So I don't think it's homogeneous across the country. I think there are areas that, especially around urban centers, where there's more transmission, community transmission, and higher risk of these fires getting out of control. And so I think we have to be vigilant around these urban centers especially. We've seen that it's essential to protect our elderly in nursing homes and long-term care facilities. They've been extremely vulnerable, and we have to protect the vulnerable, and that's been important, an important thing moving forward here. My own feeling is that we are now in the midst of this pandemic. We're sort of hitting the peak spot. I feel like by June or July, we will be on the other side of this mountain. And then important questions will have to be asked about how do we turn on the tap again in terms of quarantining or self-isolating, letting people go back to work, letting kids go back to school, et cetera, et cetera. And I think by the summer we will be asking those questions, and we'll be relying on policymakers to provide that guidance so that we can go back safely. If we do it too fast, there's a risk of, I think, a second wave emerging, because we don't, as a society, have herd immunity yet. Herd immunity is this concept that enough people were infected that we're now protected as a society, as a community. I don't think we're at that. So we won't be at that spot by the summer. And so if you open up again too fast, you can get another second wave. And we have to protect our intensive care units. We only have so many beds, so many ventilators. And so that's the other issue, is that this flattening of the curve is the way to go. But when do you turn, the big question, when do you turn back on these activities without triggering a second wave? From a medical scientific perspective, where I come from, it's really understanding this disease, understanding this infectious disease. How transmissible is it from person to person would be one of the first questions. How virulent or dangerous is this virus in human beings? That's another question. How is it spreading from country to country? And what are the key countermeasures that we can do to kind of contain it? Are all essential public health questions. From a diagnostic point of view, and testing became so critical early on in this pandemic, do we have the tools in our toolbox to be able to test this virus in high volumes so that we can quickly identify who's infected and then make sure that they're quarantined or self-isolated? And that became and is still a very important question. In the hospitals, understanding how to manage patients with COVID-19. What are the interventions we can do to prevent mortality? Who are the highest risk individuals for mortality? That became and is still a very important question. Do we have any medications that work already in our arsenal that we could use? And of course, the ultimate question is the vaccine. How quickly can we deploy a vaccine to curtail the spread of this virus? And that's just the beginning. There are so many questions, and we can get into the societal impacts of isolation, the psychological impacts of isolation, the impacts on the economy. But for the research community, those were kind of the priority issues. I think Canada is well prepared, was well prepared, and is well prepared. And I think central to that is our public health system. And when we look at our neighbors south of the border, we see how COVID-19 can expose healthcare systems very easily because of the way it spreads. It's indiscriminate. And so we all believe in saving lives. We all believe in preventing bad outcomes. And so in that sense, I think our Canadian healthcare system was very well prepared based on its approach to managing individuals and access to that healthcare system. I think where we weren't that well prepared, if I can be a little bit critical, is our self-sufficiency. We rely a lot on international sourcing for things like diagnostic testing, for medications, ventilators, personal protective equipment, and perhaps where we are a little less well prepared is our ability to be self-sufficient. I was a recipient of funding that came via the Canadian Institutes for Health Research and Genome Canada and Genome Alberta. So I'm very fortunate to be in a position to say, okay, well, we're putting these funds to work right away. And this has been really remarkable how quickly the peer review of those proposals took place in a matter of days, which may be unprecedented. Volunteers across the country were able to peer review this in a very rigorous process, and awards went out, and there were second and perhaps third waves of awards that have been made available. So I think this has been great. It's been unprecedented, and I think this is one of the positive elements that has come out of this. Having said that, how much is enough? And that's a big question here. Is have we put in enough funds into this to make it truly something that can have impact? And how do we also rally around industry partners? Would it be prudent to have industry, venture capital perhaps, also contribute to this research strategy? Because we all know the entire economy is essentially in a standstill situation. So it's in everyone's best interest to work together here. And I think some public-private partnerships may also be valuable right now to really further leverage the funding. We need to know what this animal is. Is it related to bats? Is it related to SARS previously in 2002? There was the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, MERS coronavirus that emerged in the Middle East. There are also existing circulating coronaviruses that already are human coronaviruses that we see every season. understanding the interplay and related relationships between these families of coronaviruses will help us, getting back to this precision medicine, specifically target this particular pandemic virus from a vaccine or diagnostic or therapeutic point of view. So genomics plays into that because the genome sequence is the source of truth in terms of the identity of this virus, and we need to know that source of truth, and so absolutely critical. I'm a big proponent of open source genetic information. I think that this should be freely available across jurisdictions. I realize this is a political environment in which we operate, and fingers are pointing at other countries as to what they did or didn't do. But for me, I think, as a medical scientific person, access to data and information is power, and I think it has to be openly available. Our main interest is diagnostics. Over the last decade or so, I've been working in resource-limited settings, in Africa, for example, trying to develop low-cost tools that provide ultra-sensitive, highly accurate diagnostic tests. I call it precision diagnostics. Traditionally, we relied on methods like culturing an organism, bringing it to life, so to speak, on media and culture. And these are relatively insensitive methods, sometimes necessary to do. But now we're seeing testing in infectious disease moving towards detecting DNA or RNA, genetic material. And those tests currently are cost prohibitive, highly sophisticated, require equipment that needs preventive maintenance, and inaccessible for some low middle income countries. So we've been focusing a lot on bringing that technology to the bedside, if you will, making it more accessible and available. And we've been looking at a specific technology called isothermal amplification. And what that means in layman's terms is essentially, detecting that genetic material in a way that doesn't need sophisticated equipment and laboratories, that we can actually detect genetic material at the bedside. So that's been our real emphasis, and that's what we wanted to do with COVID-19 as well, is build on that experience working in resource-limited settings and seeing if we can use that technology to detect COVID-19 in the community, and that's what we're trying to do. Point-of-care tools are essential because, in my view, you're taking the test to the patient's bedside, and so, or house, or to a port of entry, and so you can act on that test result in a more rapid fashion. So that time to result, that time to action is reduced, and that early intervention may prevent further spread, in this case, of COVID-19. And ideally, you don't want individuals who are infected coming into waiting rooms and hospitals and spreading that infection to others. So for those reasons, point-of-care testing has value. In terms of the second question, how close are we? There are already commercially available options that have been developed by large diagnostic companies. The issue around that is access to that. As you can imagine, everybody wants one of those instruments or one of those tests. And so here again, this goes back to my earlier point, where local domestic innovation has to really be promoted, so that we're not relying on international sourcing for things like this. We need domestic options, and this has been highlighted in this pandemic. Is that we may not be the first in the queue if everybody wants something that's available internationally. COVID-19 is an RNA virus, and so determining the genomic sequence of that virus is essential. We need to know how much variability there is. Is it just one clone, or are there many clones that are circulating? And that may inform us in terms of how a vaccine might work. Some vaccines are specific to certain clones, and so if there are multiple clones, this may inform us that, okay, well, we need to develop a vaccine that can target several clones so that it's universally useful. So absolutely, sequencing or DNA or RNA sequencing is essential. And we saw that with this pandemic. Very early on, Chinese scientists made available sequences of COVID-19 that allowed international laboratories to quickly develop a diagnostic tool that could target that virus. So really quite amazing how things have changed, that so fast now we can have this information available in a matter of days. An entire sequence of a genome of a virus is available to develop diagnostic tools or vaccines. It's hard to argue against the importance of a vaccine. Vaccines as a public health intervention for infectious diseases has always been paramount. It really is a powerful tool, and I would argue that in this instance, time is of the essence, and we need to push forward and develop a vaccine. Diagnostics has also been very important. We've seen that, again, having domestic supply chains of reagents and commercial options within country, absolutely essential, and ramping up testing so that we can offer the test to as many people as possible early on in a pandemic is, again, critical. And so research into that technology is important. And I would argue that also the DNA RNA sequencing that we alluded to in the previous question is part of that process, is the genomic or epidemiology of that COVID-19 outbreak, understanding it. What are the Canadian strains? Is it mutating? Is it changing? Its behavior is important. And then I guess finally is drug development. We need tools in our toolkit to try and prevent deaths. And right now there aren't good randomized clinical trials demonstrating the importance of a particular drug. And that is the gold standard of understanding the impact of a drug, is a randomized clinical trial. So we really need to prioritize that in terms of the clinical research that's available to us. A big theme is innovation and self-sufficiency. Having our own solutions to pandemic preparedness in terms of diagnostics, vaccines, therapeutics, so that we're not handcuffed in terms of what we can do to save lives is important. And I think this may be one of the emerging themes from this pandemic, and lessons learned is that domestic capacity for innovation should be there. And so in terms of policy, I think one perhaps lesson here is that there's no one size fits all. We saw different patterns of spread and transmission in different countries, and we've seen that play out in countries like Italy and Spain, and the US, where there's been really very significant cases. And you contrast that with countries like Germany, where there's been lots of cases but not so many deaths. So I think there's some lessons learned here in terms of policy. Does self-isolation really work? How long does self-isolation, how long can that go on for? And when and how do you slowly turn off the tap, so to speak, or turn on the tap back so that the economy can get recharged? These are really important health policy questions, and I think, and I hope that, although this is not my area, there's a lot of research into this as well, so that we can better forecast and model these kinds of events, so that we're not so much in the dark and chasing our tail, making policy changes week to week. So I think this modeling aspect is important, and then understanding that health policy impact. We will definitely see another epidemic of this proportion. There's no question in my mind. The question is when, not if. And so, we have to be prepared. And I spoke about short-term memory. I think there need to be dedicated individuals whose daily activity is monitoring and planning for such events and ensuring that there's good information coming back so that we know how to prepare. So it's a lot easier to put out a fire before it starts. And so this internationalization is something that is important as well of this process. I don't think we can, in a silo here, prepare for something that's starting in a different continent. We need good information flow about what's happening. And my hope is that organizations like the World Health Organization can play a very critical role here in gathering data and providing that information, so that governments can respond in a timely fashion. Thanks for that question. It's stressful. I sit on the fence. I'm a researcher, but I also provide services in the healthcare system. And so I see both sides of this equation, the need for innovation and research, but also the need for provision of services and ensuring patient safety and healthcare worker safety, and all of those elements, and providing laboratory testing in a timely fashion. So it's stressful because it's nonstop. There's no time off. Weekends, evenings, it's just going on. And in fact, I was just talking with my colleagues down the hall today. I think we decided that it's better to actually split us apart, because if one of us gets infected with COVID-19 and we spread it down the hall, we're all out. The whole department's gone. So one of the things we're doing now is splitting us up. Some will stay at home and work at home. Some will stay in this office area. And then we're moving some of our staff to a third area so that there isn't this risk of losing an entire division in our healthcare system. So all these are stressful things and change how we operate day to day. And of course, there's family considerations, homeschooling and things like that, pressures that occur at home. So you're trying to balance both being at work and also dealing with things like that. I'm Professor Dylan Pillai, and this is My Future Economy.